I want to thank Almut and Gabriele for inviting me to participate in this seminar. It is a privilege to be in the company of so many distinguished longtime friends and acquaintances. And undeniably, it is one of the silver linings of the long siege of pandemic that people are able to gather virtually for so many purposes. To prepare this presentation, I have tried to take a fresh look at issues I was thinking and writing about from 50 to 30 years ago. In principle, I do not like to go back to old problems on which I have already had my say in print, but both my own work on the scholia of the Euripidean triad and the other new editions of Greek scholia published in the last decades have perhaps lent a little freshness to my approach. I have to acknowledge that I have benefited from reviewing in late 2020 a draft of the edition of Scholia on Andromache by Jacopo Cavarzaran, and from co-supervising the Cologne dissertation of Giulio Dovico, an edition of the Scholia on Medea, which was defended 3 months ago. I'd also note that access to the university library at Berkeley and even to my office, where a great many of my editions and commentaries reside for lack of space in my home, have been less than ideal. And so I ask your understanding if there are gaps in my references. In the surviving scholia on Attic drama, there are a number of types of information that either explicitly or potentially bear on the issue of interpolation. The main ones to consider are shown in the first 6 sections of the handout under the 6 Roman numerals. The first is the eupheratai type, noting the absence of a verse or verses in a copy examined by an ancient scholar or commentator, or a medieval scholar, scribe, or reader. Along with the second category, those using instead of feratai a form of heurisco. The third category, the recording of the scholarly act of athetein. Fourth, suspicions of a passage that a commentator justified by a stylistic judgment, namely about what is superfluous, that is periton or perison. 5, judgments of inauthenticity using the verb nothuo or the adjective nothos. And 6, claims that lines have been added by actors who modified the text in reperformance of the play. Also under 7, as that indicates, the verb hypoptuo, which is familiar in Homeric scholia, plays little role in the scholia on tragedy and comedy. By the way, I have looked at Aristophanes' scholia as well, just to round out the picture. As it will show, the information provided by scholia is often subject to uncertainty. First of all, because of the composite and highly filtered nature of the corpus, we usually have no answer to the question, who wrote this comment at what date and based on what evidence. A second source of uncertainty lies in the risks that were involved in the passage of a comment from a full standalone commentary to its eventual home in the margin of a manuscript, or from a continuous marginal commentary to an independent marginal position, or vice versa. Hence, we have cases where we have to guess to what line or lines the comment refers. Thirdly, some of the terminology that may be used in explaining lines not attested in all copies or in justifying suspicion or aestheticis is exactly the same that occurs in criticism of poetic and stylistic defects. For instance, perison, anoikeon, allogon, all of which can be raised as objections against what a critic does not doubt is the author's work. Let's start then with the first type. The eupheratai type, section 1 on the handout, normally consists of 3 elements. The fact of abstinence is noted with eupheratai or eupherintai. The basis of the claim is often revealed in the phrase en tissin, with or without antigraphois, and else with en polois antigraphois or en tois polois antigraphois, occasionally with no modifier en tois antigraphois. Once we even find the singular ento antigrapho. We cannot be sure whether the presence or absence of the article with polois in these scholia is significant, that is, vaguely many copies or the majority of copies, because the textual tradition of scholia cannot be relied on in this detail. After a preposition, articles were easily added or omitted by scribes, even apart from the graphic tendencies of abbreviation and suspension that could reduce the indication of an article to a very small element easily missed or easily obscured by fading or damage. There is never any indication of just what universe of copies are being referred to in what location at what date. The observations might be, in some cases, go back to early Alexandrian commentators and reflect familiarity with multiple copies in libraries in the possession of scholars, but they may also date to later centuries, since our scholia seem to derive mainly from compilations that accreted in the 2nd through the 6th centuries. And we even find, as late as the 14th century, scholar scribes commenting on eupheratai. The extent of the unattested passage is usually expressed in houtos hostikos, less often iambos, or the plural version. And in a more explicit form, houtoi hoi duo, or houtoi hoi tesseres, or the like. The reference of the demonstrative pronoun is problematic in many examples, as we'll see. In an ancient commentary in its own book roll, one would expect a lemma to show exactly where in the text the note applies. Alternatively, in a wide enough margin or intercolumnium, a short eupheratai note could be placed right beside the verse to which the demonstrative refers. Critical signs could also help to make the claim clear, but such signs did not fare well in the textual tradition and may never have caught on outside of a small circle of top scholars. When we reach the medieval minuscule codices, we find that some scholia have become unrooted from their location and appear out of order, and notes can run together and seem to belong to the wrong lemma. In some copies, the scribes include few lemmata and no reference symbols. The recantiores of Euripides of the late 13th and early 14th centuries are full of such confusions, but confusions are not absent from older and more ambitious copies like B and M and V of Euripides. Finally, some of the eupheratai notes survive very narrowly, having been placed in a small space in the inner margin or between scholia column and dramatic text, where they were easily neglected by a copyist transcribing the main block of scholia from a page. Some brief marginal notations were not known until the mid or late 19th century. The first type, eupheratai, survives almost exclusively in the Euripidean scholia, which in general give us the most examples on the handout. If we start with the first play of the triad, the first example, Hecuba 1096, number 1 on your handout, is one that has not been present in existing editions. This is a case in which the eupheratai is not a clue to interpolation, but merely reflects the fact that at some point in the commentary and scholia tradition, someone was checking more than one copy and recorded that the second of the two lines beginning with gunaikos was absent in some. Style and meter and the occurrence of homeoarchton all indicate that the absent line is a genuine one. Note also how RF here has a version without hostikos, and since RF has no reference symbol or lemma, the reference of houtos is left completely unclear. And we have only the fact that the note occurs between those on 1094 and 1098 to suggest the range in which the relevant line would fall. We'll see more of this sort of problem again. There are apparently similar mechanical omissions reported in the scholia on Aristophanes' piece, 1335 and following. Although both the scholia contain unresolved corruptions, and the first scholia leaves uncertainty about the exact extent of the omission, they presumably refer to omission due to homeoteluton and homeoarchton. These two are the only instances of eupheratai that I found in the Aristophanes scholia. And here I've added the images of D, which shows how they're placed, how the things are placed. The second one actually has a reference symbol, which you can see before the note and also above the word oikeseta there. Another accidental error is seen in Hecuba 1100, number 3 on the handout. Here the gloss aithera has slipped into the text, and it is carried by all the manuscripts cited in the OCT, and all the ones that I know of. Again, in this case, someone has collated multiple copies at some date when text free of the interpolated words still existed. The alternative forms of this note in V and RW, in which N-Tissi is inappropriately attached to a parison comment, allow various reconstructions of their origin. For example, V could have arisen as a conflation where the BPR version was followed by a separate comment saying to aithera parison, and then a so du mem os mem produced the corruption. In any case, it is noteworthy that we here find parison in a note on an eupheratai type. Phoenici 375, our fourth example, provides one of unambiguous placement, with M having the note above line 375 and B and C having it right beside the same line. The note is thus not in a continuous sequence of marginal scholia, and it is absent from the important witness V and from the recantiores. The case against 375 is widely accepted, but the deletion of the following 3 lines has to be argued on the grounds of internal features found suspicious by many, and they are difficult features. Conversely, the scholium assigned to Phoenici 1075, number 5 on your handout, by Valkener and Schwartz, offers a taste of the confusion possible in our scholia tradition. This note has been attached, had been attached to 1073 in earlier editions because Arsenius prints it with a lemma, hu par aspida bebekas, which actually spans the end of 1073 and the beginning of 1074. C writes it above 1071, and that placement fits the position in B and V. In B, there is no lemma or reference symbol, but it occurs between notes on 1069 and 1073-4. And in V, it runs on from a note on 1070. As my commentary on Phoenici 1071 and 1075 explains, various deletions, some of more than one line, have been proposed in the opening lines of this episode, usually invoking the e01 note. 1075 certainly seems to be redundant and ill-placed, and I agree with Valkener, it is the most likely single line in this passage to be inauthentic. But as an editor of the Scholia, I now find the case for assigning the note to 1071 to have considerable appeal on mechanical grounds. At Phoenici 1225, which is item 6, the case for recognizing interpolation is very strong because we have not only an e01 note, but also a note on the transition from narrative to direct speech, apo to diegematicou eis to mimetikon. This phrase is standard in the Homeric Scholia to comment on a direct speech that begins without having a speech formula in the immediately preceding line, although there may be one in the second line before it, but also to comment on a sudden shift to second person address within a speech that has been to that point all impersonal, as if a narrative. The Scholia on Hippolytus 1240 has exactly the same phrase, apo to diegematicou eis to mimetikon metame, when the messenger transitions to the direct speech of Hippolytus to his horses within a narrative without an introductory verb of speaking. In 6, we also have the lepe explanation, which also indicates the same idea. This is typical of the assistance that Scholia give the student or reader with construing anything that is even slightly elliptical. Whoever commented thus on the transition from 1224 to 1226 did not have 1225 in his text. So despite the way in which the e01 note has ended up attached or to or conflated with comments on 1226, we can be fairly confident that it belongs to 1225. Probably it was once in the margin of the verse, and when incorporated into a new copy of the Scholia occurring in a block in the side margin, it ended up a little out of order. The case of Hippolytus 1050, number 7 on the handout, is also fairly straightforward. Here the e01 note was first collated by Dindorf from B, where it is present in the inner margin and thus was neglected in the apographs of B, which in turn caused the omission of this note from Arsenius's first edition. Before Dindorf, in his 1854 first edition of Euripides, Nelk bracketed both 1049 and 1050, noting that Berck had rejected 1049 because it repeats 898 except for the person of the verb, and that he himself suspected 1050, but he could not yet cite the Scholia. I'm not exactly sure who was the first to delete just 1050 without deleting 1049 as well, although that is the way it's done in modern editions since Barrett. The next two items, 8 and 9, display different forms of displacement. 8 and 8, we find the majority of our manuscripts, the verse Phoenici 976, repeated after line 1281, where it makes no sense. I believe this is an accidental intrusion of a marginal quotation, that is, hein men phthaso in 1280 reminded someone of ein de hystereses in 976. Here we actually have surviving manuscripts in which the verse is indeed not carried, plus the testimony of Triclinius that the better ones among the copies do not have the line. Wherefore, he says, this has been rejected also by me as inappropriately present. The e01 note is only in B in the inner margin and was first noticed by Schwarz, while the Triclinian Scholion was first brought to light by Turin in 1957. In item 9 from Andromache, we again see the position of the note is misleading in some witnesses, but fortunately M is clear enough about its place. Mathieu already placed it with 1254 on the basis of a late manuscript in Torino. Kobet related it to 1252 on the basis of V. Editors deleted 1254 at least as early as Kirchhoff in 1855, but Jackson cleverly suggested that the line is genuine Euripides and has been displaced from its original position after 1235, an idea that has been accepted by Stevens and Diggle and Kovacs. We now turn to instances where 2 to 4 verses are said to be absent in some copies. Number 10 is another B scholion, not known until scholars studied B in the mid-19th century. The reference of hutoi is indicated by positioning the note at the level of line 871 of Hippolytus, as you can see here. Example 11 is clear enough as to identification of the lines involved, since the e01 report is part of a note on Orestes 957 with a lemma from that line, while M, B, and V have reference symbols, and M's marginal note begins right next to the end of line 957. The commentator adds a reason why the line should be suspected, that the observation of impending lamentation is superfluous, although perisson does not occur here. Modern commentators find more anomalies and infelicities than raised by the scholiast. Both our manuscripts and those of the authors of several scholia in this vicinity have Electra singing everything from 960 onward, which gives an excellent motivation for the addition of the triplet 957 to 59 to be spoken by the chorus. Whereas many of the interpolated single lines marked by eupheratai notes are of a sort that could well arise through mechanisms typical of copying and collating among scribes and readers, this is a case in which it is very plausible that the theatrical tradition was involved. The assignment of 960 and following to Electra could be part of the aggrandizement of a virtuoso performer's role. Although Willink makes an interesting case for making the strophe and antistrophe antiphonal, with the second half of the strophe and antistrophe assigned to the chorus and the first part to Electra, the great generality of even the first half of these stanzas persuades me that Weil's approach is somewhat more attractive. The beginning of the ritual appeal of Agamemnon to Agamemnon and Orestes, item 12, brings another case where the reference of the demonstrative is far from clear. Once again, the oldest witness, M, has the note in the margin close to the dramatic text. Most of the scholia on this sparsely annotated page of M are placed as close to the relevant line as possible and also have reference symbols. In the case of 12, however, it is written close to 1229 to 30, but has no reference symbol. In C, if we speculate the scholian ending mark is accidentally omitted from a note on 1225, then our note is in fact at the level of 1227, which would support the modern interpretation that the 4 lines referred to are 1227 to 30. The wording of this note is also atypical, apart from M's accidental lack of the negative. First, it used the singular ento antigrapho. In reference to a singular exemplar is uncommon in such scholia. In 2 examples from the old scholia on Aristophanes, it is associated with the verb huron, I found, so that it voices the experience of a single, now anonymous commentator. In the scholia on Euclid, there are 2 instances of the phrase ento saracenico antigrapho, where we have the modifier localizing the manuscript. And one of those has the impersonal Euripides. So it could be that this Orestes scholion is an abridgment of a comment originally expressed in the first person with huron. Or has a modifier been lost, such as the name of a Hellenistic scholar? Or the singular could simply be a corruption of the plural with a sign of for hoist being misread as a suspended form of omega. Secondly, the additional phrase kai en alo de or kai en alois de is likewise a pretty rare expression. The parallels show that Kirchhoff's deletion of kai is justified, and the sense must be, but in another or in others, depending which reading you take, these 4 verses are carried. There's no easy way to decide here between M's alo and C's alois. An alternative to theratai is a passive form of heurisco, heuritai, heurethe, heurisketai. These are commonly used in scholia to mention variant readings found in other copies and also in grammatical observations about orthography or the like. There seem to be only 2 instances in the scholia on drama referring to missing lines, and both come from 14th century sources. In 13, the choral lyric of Aeschylus 7, Triclinius cites textual evidence for absence in some old copies of a 7-word phrase, which was originally an explanatory paraphrase on this line, as well as pointing out in his usual way that something is perisson in terms of metrical correspondence. And so he has removed the words from his text, the correct remedy. Example 14 presents a more curious case. The manuscript source is Gudianus Graecus 15, a notable source of Paleologan scholia in the editions of Matthai and Dindorf. Around 1330, a scribe designated with the siglum GR wrote the text and added an almost complete set of Moscopolae scholia and glosses, along with a very few Taman items. Either shortly thereafter or a decade or 2 later, depending on what authority you follow, a scribe designated GU very diligently reviewed the annotation in the manuscript and in extremely small script, supplied any Moscopolian items that GR had omitted, mainly in the Hecuba, and he added a fairly complete set of the annotation from the Tamano-Triclinian circle, plus additional items either shared by very few contemporary copies or found exclusively so far in GU. On some pages, it is possible to see that GU made some additions at a second stage, and that is true of this scholia on page 49 verso. It is very odd that GU2 uses the plural en antigraphois here. As far as I have been able to check, the line is not missing in any surviving manuscript of Orestes, so it's surprising to hear that he claimed that there are multiple copies he saw. The other unique annotations of GU or GU2 do not inspire confidence that the scribe had access to unusual older traditions. In any case, the note does not seem to have had any effect on editors. Willink is mistaken when he says that Paley deleted 1067 as inorganic. In the second edition of his Euripides with commentary, but not in the first edition or in his text-only editions, Paley puts lines 1066, not 1067 in brackets, without any reference to G Euscholion on 1067, and Paley indicates that his motivation is the desire to have 10 instead of 11 lines in Orestes' speech, so that it will be exactly equal to the 10 lines of Orestes' previous speech. The next group of passages features the verb atheteo, or the noun athetesis. While these words occur hundreds of times in the Homeric scholia, there are only 2 applications of them in tragic scholia and 1 application in the Aristophanes scholia. In some Homeric instances, an athetesis is reported and attributed to a scholar such as Aristarchus or Xenodotus. The scholia then also add a reason, or more than one reason, and there is sometimes room to suspect that a later commentary knew only the fact of athetesis from a critical sign or a brief marginal note, but then supplied a reason or reasons by inference, not necessarily reflecting the thinking of the named scholar. It is generally recognized that athetesis in Homer cannot automatically be assumed to be based on external evidence such as absence of lines from some copies, but often rested on the stylistic or moralizing judgment of the ancient critic, strongly influenced by the strictures of Xenophanes and Plato and others had made against what became the greatest identity-forming works of Greek paideia. This subjectivity is also to be seen in the 2 instances from tragedy. The case of Orestes 640 to 41, item 15, is apparently straightforward. It is uniformly transmitted as belonging to line 640. The athetesis is based on a stylistic judgment. They do not have the stamp of Euripidean style. Willink explains well the function and Euripidean character of the couplet, and it is not deleted in modern editions. As far as I will check older ones, Deckline in 1900 had it in brackets. The stylistic judgment made here need not be treated with any special respect. 2 other lines in the vicinity are, however, deleted in Willink and Diggle, and it is, of course, possible that the scholion has been incorrectly assigned to 640 in the tradition of our scholia. Item 16, then, in our tradition, in the first episode of Sophocles' Oedipus and Colonus, rhetorically minded critics of a type we see more often in the Euripides scholia objected to the argumentative strategy that the Sophoclean text displays in response to the hostility of the chorus once they hear Oedipus's name. They suggest the proper approach would have had Oedipus begin his long complaint and self-defense directly after line 236. In the interpolation hunting heyday of the 19th century, Cobbett and others unwisely agreed. As is typical of the Sophoclean scholia, the judgment is reported only to be refuted by a critic who has a strong admiration for Sophocles' artistry. But this critic also notes at the end, "We did not find anything obelized in the commentary of Didymus." If this critic had access to a fairly complete and unaltered version of Didymus's comments, which is of course by no means certain, his remarks suggest the proposal was not that of a Hellenistic critic earlier than Didymus. And it's my suspicion that such rhetorically biased criticisms do come from the Roman imperial period. Editors and commentators have justifiably struggled over the confused state of the dialogue near the end of Aristophanes' Frogs, 17. Not surprising, the problem had already been noticed by Aristarchus and Apollonius. The reason for suspicion given our scholia in the former case is said to be because the lines are rather vulgar and cheap, hardly a compelling argument, I would think, about all lines of old comedy. In the latter, that they have no relevance to the flow of the passage. The Scholion on 1452 notes that this verse 2 must go if 1437 to 1441 are deleted. Here, a singular is used in athetetai, hutos, menon, and akuroi. But in fact, if you take out 1452, then 1453 and perhaps part of 1451 would have to be deleted with it. So once again, we have a reference in our transmitted scholion that reflects corruption or misunderstanding of an earlier observation or critical sign. Moderns see a conflation of different recensions here, which I need not go into. Now, I did not quote on the handout Tzetzi's long comment on this matter, but if you're into which is referred to there at the bottom of 17. But if you are in the mood for Tzetzi's egocentrism, which one may find hilarious and appalling at the same time, I recommend you look it up. 18 is included on the handout because it is the only other place in the tragic scholia where athetein occurs, and here Euripides is criticized for not displaying the best rhetorical strategy. As I said, this happens more often in Euripides than scholia, but such criticism by no means needs to be associated with the proposing athetesis. It is to Homer that athetusi applies here. Now, more common than the mention of athetesis are the declarations that something is perisson, gathered under Roman numeral 4. The adjective and the related verb perituein have many uses and grammatical explanations of various kinds found in our scholia. Only the adjective occurs in annotations that are potentially related to interpolation. Triclinius uses it regularly to describe words he finds in excess in a strophe or antistrophe compared to the corresponding stanza, and being perisson is the reason for his casting out exeblethe, that is, omitting the words from his text. Scholia and Andromache 6 and 7, 19 on our handout, contain a report of someone's judgment that line 7 is perissos, another report that actors added line 7. So clearly the word is at least indirectly linked to a claim of inauthenticity here. One may conjecture, could have concluded from some mention of actors meddling, or could have used the term atheteo or nothuo. In this case, the deletion has long been accepted by moderns, since Falconer already cited Scholian on line 7 to support the deletion. But we now also have P. Oxy 449 of the 3rd century CE, in which line 5 is followed immediately by line 7. Of the other examples I gathered, only Phoenici 428 on 20 gives a possible hint that the comment may have been part of a longer note in which a statement of suspicion was put forward. Line 428 looks like a gloss, dissois gambrois, expanded into a trimeter that repeats for no useful reason information that was just conveyed in 419 to 423. And since the 18th century, it has rightly been deleted in most editions. The presence of gar in tuto gar perisson suggests that something may once have preceded. A statement of suspicion is probable, but not the only possibility. Others are sese meotai, which is found a dozen times in the Scholia on Euripides, or kekiastai, which is found in the Scholia on Medea in 1346, and one on Sophocles Philoctetes 201. In view of the inclusion of gar, the use of tuto, and the precise superlinear position, where it's not over the beginning of the line, but over sungamos in the second half of the line, in both M and C, we might reconstruct the fuller form of the Scholian original form as, this verse is athetized, for the phrase sungamos gar estemos is superfluous because it has already been revealed above. Subsequently, on this scenario, quotation tos sungamos gar estemos became simply tuto when the latter part of the comment became separated and was written above the words themselves. In a later passage of Phoenici, 21 on the handout, a Scholian tells us that line 974 is superfluous after 973, and there is no verbal clue that the observation of redundancy is related to aestheticis or suspicion. So we are left as often only with the inference that such an opinion was once expressed, and can have no idea whether the hypothetical critic also had evidence from copies without the verse. It is worth noting this isn't one of the places where the ancient evidence raises the possibility of suspicion of a single line, but some modern scholars end up proposing the deletion of more than one line, as Willing did here. Other examples of this discrepancy between a Scholian about one line and modern suspicion of two or more are seen in examples 5, 7, and 22. Turn now to 22. In 22, the case of Medea 87, there is again need for inference about the full import of the observation, perissos prosketai. Prosketai in Scholia serves as a passive alternative to the active prosetheka, or occasionally prosethekon. The most common third singular prosetheka has as subject the poet or his character, and is used in explanation of the choice of a particular word or the stylistic decision to include a particular phrase. There is a frustrating case of this usage in the problematic Scholian on Hippolytus 171, which appears to say that Aristophanes of Byzantium criticized Euripides for using the ekuklema while also including komizdusa in his script, and the phrase there is prosetheka perissos. The third plural is much rarer and has as subject the actors, as seen in example 19, hoi hypocritai ton iambon prosethekon, or perhaps readers or copyists, as in a note of Triclinius on Prometheus 400, where he ejects the word lebomena for lack of responsion by his analysis, and says it was added by those who did not understand the syntax. In this Scholian, Wecklein and Ellsberger suggested that what is understood with or has been lost along with the haughty, supplemented at the beginning by Reitzenstein, is sese meotai, matching the verb in the second sentence of the note. But the second haughty clause does sound like an additional charge against a verse that is under suspicion rather than a stylistic observation of a type more commonly made in the form apo tu heniku epito plethuntikon metebe, usually followed by a further explanation. Note also how here the version in O, abbreviated in a way that is typical of the manuscript O, has become misleading in the process. The Scholian on Trojan women, 863, item 23, has to be assumed to carry a truncated version of some critic's observation if it refers to suspicion or aestheticis. Line 863 cannot be suspected or deleted by itself, since that leaves an incomplete gar clause. So suspicion would have to be attached to 862 as well. Indeed, a commentator could have argued that Helenein in 862 is perisson for the same reason, that my wife is insufficient as a reference to Helen. Could the perisson comment once have belonged to 862 instead? 862 could have been like Phoenici 428, a proper name gloss expanded into a full trimeter, but one would expect the gloss to be filled out with a phrase that was syntactically complete within the one line. Moreover, Menelaus could also have begun life as a gloss, but if someone was competent enough to incorporate both glosses and expand 862 so that it carried over with enjambment into 863, how was the same interpolator so incompetent as to fill out 863 with the mysteriously irrelevant and the Achaean army? Deleting both lines certainly smooths the text, but it may be an instance of what I call deleting the difficulty. I think there is still unsolved corruption in these lines. West and Kovacs assume a lacuna. The last example in this series, 24, is the only one not from the Euripides scholia. For some reason, Holverda in his apparatus says that R has this near 913, where closely similar words are repeated. But as you can see from the image on the handout, it is in the left margin at 909, beginning at the level of Musaon Therapon and continuing for 2 more lines so that the note has the shape of a downward pointing triangle. Dunbar speculates whether it could apply to the words kataton homeron and cites the position in R spanning 910 as well. But the default assumption, I think, should be that the position implies reference to 909, whether that assignment is what the original commentator intended or not. It is true that speaking of the first instance of kataton homeron as superfluous could make some sense if the reader has no appreciation for the deliberate bathos and for the humor of the upcoming repetition. In all this uncertainty, we cannot tell whether anyone ever suspected words in this passage, and if anyone did, it seems to be they were wrong. In literary history or commentary, nothos is a term applied to whole works that are believed not to be the authentic writings of the author under whose name they are transmitted. In the argument to Rhesus, we hear that some suspected the drama was nothon, and the life of Euripides lists Tenes, Rhadamanthus, and Perithous as 3 considered spurious, nothuetai. Likewise, in the catalog of Aeschylean plays, the Metachaeus, both a genuine and a spurious aitnai are listed. For passages within plays, the term is found only in 2 Sophoclean scholia. In 25, in Ajax's final speech, various lines have been bracketed in different editions, with some reference to the comment traditionally printed as belonging to line 841. The Metachaeus L here has as lemma the phrase tos autos vages, the last words of line 841, and the scholion falls beside 837 to 845 in the margin. Tauta ought to be these words, or perhaps these statements, but obviously it cannot be just these 2 words, tos autos vages, that were believed to have been inserted in the passage to make fully clear what is being said. If these 2 words are to be eliminated, they carry the previous 2.5 lines as well as the next with them. Once again, we would have to assume that the specific lemma attached to the scholion is misleading. As far as the surviving note informs us, the aestheticis was based on a critical judgment and not external evidence, but there is linguistic evidence cited by our commentators. In the scholion on Sophocles' Antigone 45, item 26, we see it begins with a short paraphrase necessitated by the ellipsis of the finite verb common in stichomuthia, and this is followed by a more elaborate paraphrase. Tacked on at the end is the report by a commentator, presumably the imperial age, that Didymus says the following verse, our line 46, was declared inauthentic by the commentators. One would dearly love to know the exact reference of the commentators and whether it was a term used by Didymus himself or is a typical anonymizing simplification of the detail by the later critic. But presumably it refers to some serious scholars of the 2 centuries before Didymus. In Sophocles' scholia, as we have them, no reference to Aristarchus survives, and only one to Aristophanes of Byzantium for his work on Proverbs. Would these commentators have doubted 46 without external evidence? Possibly so, if an ancient scholar were as enamored of absolute regularity in stichomuthia as many 19th century philologists were. Again, if line 46 is spurious, it has the look of a gloss on ton gunemon filled out into a full trimeter. The last major category of scholastic comment related to interpolation in my survey involves the explicit claim that actors have added to the text of tragedy, under 6 here. The scholia are to be evaluated against the background of other claims about actors, which generally reflect disapproval by scholars. Examples include a claim that in Orestes, a silent procession was staged showing Helen and the booty from Troy entering the Scane building before the first lines of the prologue, and that in the madness scene of Orestes, the actor playing Orestes did not have a visible bow and arrow. Many scholars have noted the tendency of commentators used in our scholia to use the actors as whipping boys in their explanations. The most striking case of this is provided by Apollodorus of Tarsus, who is quoted in the scholia on Medea 148 and 169, trying to solve the problema of the reference to Zeus in Medea 169. He uses the forms of the verb synkeo, confused mess up, of the speaker assignment the actor supposedly created, which is in fact the one adopted by modern editors from the manuscript tradition. In fact, it is Apollodorus' distribution of lines that is improbable or impossible. Actors are also blamed for changing the rare verb ekphros in Phoenici 264 to the common one methos because of the difficulty of pronouncing it, although such a banalization could easily arise in textual transmission. Twice in Medea, they are blamed for not recognizing the correct punctuation of a line and altering the text. At 228, the change from gignosko kalos to gignoske kalos could easily have occurred in copying it in the unpunctuated text of a papyrus roll. At Medea 85, on the other hand, the larger change of arti gignoskes tode to tuto gignoske saphos probably does point to a conscious intervention, in which case actors are a possible agent. The same can be said of the attempt to repair the corruption in Medea 910. The most notorious instance of scholastic claim that actors added lines must be that of Orestes 1366-68, 27 on your handout. First of all, from the very phrasing of the comment, it seems unlikely that there was external evidence known to the commentator, that is, copies in which the 3 lines were absent. He says, these 3 lines one would not readily concede to be by Euripides, but rather one would assume they are by the actors, who, in order not to hurt themselves when jumping down from the royal palace, open the door and proceed out wearing the costume and mask of the Phrygian. So then, in order that they plausibly be seen coming out, they added these lines. But from what they themselves say, they bear witness against coming out through the door, for it is obvious from the following lines that the Phrygian jumped over. The rejection of the 3 lines is thus the solution to a problema about how entrance through the door can be reconciled with hyperteramna, a problema that has prompted various solutions both in antiquity and modern times. For my understanding of the probabilities of the nature of the skene in 408 BCE, I doubt, along with many others, that Euripides had his actor leap from the skene roof to the stage, as this scholar alleges. Scholion in 1371 offers 2 other ancient solutions. One appears to assume that any jumping over has taken place inside the palace complex, from one area into the main courtyard, imagined to be behind the palace door represented on stage. This idea is taken up in the Scholia GU on 1369. It was advocated by A.M. Dell in her famous article, Seen and Unseen on the Greek Stage. The other solution is that of Aeschylus, a scholar who is also quoted in the Scholion on Orestes 12, about whom we know nothing else. He posited that huper is here used in the same sense as pro, conveying the sense in front of the palace. Di Benedetto, Willink, and Medveda have cited support for this sense of huper and endorsed Aeschylus' view, and I now think this is the most likely of the solutions. 2 scholia on Medea report that Didymus knew of copies in which line 380, this is 28, Sige domus es bas kinestrotai lekos, appeared not only after line 379, but also after Creon's last line, 356, Ugarti drases denon hon phobos meke. This falsely repeated line is not found in any surviving manuscript, and no papyrus yet published gives any evidence for this part of the text. So although the Scholion, as we have it, does not say so, I would assume that Didymus also knew of copies in which the line was not present after 356. The scholia concerning this are carried only in B and its epigraphs, and the marginal position of Scholion 380, which has no lemma or reference symbol, caused it to be assigned to 379 until Schwartz's edition, another demonstration of the ambiguity of the references in such scholia in the form that we have them. As to the origin of the repetition, one can imagine a reader who knows the play thinking ahead to the later passage when reading 355 to 356 and quoting 380 in the margin as a refutation of Creon's assertion. Didymus, however, ascribed the intrusion to actors. Is this just a scholarly reflex, or did a producer or actor actually think this addition improved Creon's characterization? I include 29 in the handout, just about the alternative prologue of the Rhesus, since again, it contains this speculation, taka an, maybe actors did this. I must pass over what I've presented in section 7, which doesn't have much relevance to tragedy, and conclude with one more example. We come at last to what I believe is the only case in which an anecdote surviving in our scholia has prompted a deletion, the notorious case of Phoenici 1 and 2, 30 on your handout. Nowadays, the external evidence against the couplet from papyri seemed overwhelming, as Haslam first indicated and I detailed in my commentary. Defenses of the couplet made subsequent to 1994 have not persuaded me. Nevertheless, from my collations of manuscripts containing Euripides scholia, I can present some new information that adds a further enigma to the puzzling report of that old belief or old opinion. The scholion is found in 10 manuscripts written between around 1000 and 1350. I have not seen a small group of scholia from around 1500, which heavily drawn upon by Arsenius, who has the scholion, but they seem to have derived mostly from B, although there was a corruption at the end. The text known from the editions has the initially odd information that the 2 poets criticized each other for not including Phoenici 1, 2, and Electra 1, but Valkener already suggested that may be deleted in both clauses, so the criticism would be directed at including the line. The surprise is that Valkener's deletion of the 2 instances of may before proetaxe creates a text actually found in the manuscript SA, Vaticanus Graecus 1345 of around 1300. Now, essay and the contemporary recensiones are given to small accidental omissions, but it is highly probable that two accidental omissions of the same word could have occurred in the same single line. Therefore, unless we take essay's version to be a transmission of the true reading from much earlier date, an assumption that would present the serious problem of explaining how may came to be inserted twice, we must conclude that essay's text came into being through the conscious intervention of someone who reasoned just as Falconer did. Vulgati si me abiciatur sensus interit commodus. I want to just conclude with a few morals of the story. Some scholia cited in interpolation arguments are not securely located in our tradition. Some Uferitae comments refer to phenomena of transmission that have nothing to do with interpolation. In many cases, we have to infer with no guarantee that a comment was once connected to an indication of uneven attestation in copies or a proposal to athetize, and not all interpolations are plausibly attributed to actors. Thank you for your patience. I hope I haven't run over too far.